In Rochester, Michigan, early in April 2023, a black-capped chickadee pair discovers one of my nesting boxes. Please join me as we watch this incredible story unfold. The black-capped chickadee builds its nest in layers, starting with moss and then adding animal hair and other soft bedding material. This pair spends 10 days building their nest. When they began to build, we had a week of spring-like days of warmer weather, but then it got cold again, as it often does in Michigan, and this fact impacts the outcome of the story. Observe how the female presses her breast into the nest as she builds the layers. She's creating the cup or the cavity into which she'll lay the eggs. At the same time, she has been scraping her underbelly against rough surfaces to remove some of the feathers so that she transfers heat to the eggs more efficiently. On day 11, the first egg is laid. The black-capped chickadee lays only one egg per day, usually in the early morning until her clutch is completed. A clutch is the total number of eggs a bird lays for each nesting attempt, and the range is 6 to 8 eggs for black-capped chickadees. When leaving her nest for food, she covers her eggs to hide them from the prying eyes of predators and, unfortunately, from the view of the camera. Once her clutch is complete, or within a day, she begins sitting on the eggs, incubating the entire clutch at once, so they hatch within 1 day of each other. In the first few days, one or both adults will be constantly finding food for the hatchlings. The male and female are almost impossible to differentiate by features, but their mannerisms are quite different. On day 17, the last egg of the clutch is laid. The female soon removes the top covering of the nest to expose the eggs. The incubation period for these birds is 12 to 13 days, and during this time the female will sit on the eggs for several hours each day. She doesn't incubate them constantly, or they would get too warm. The eggs must not get too cold or too warm. But since it is very cold for this nesting attempt, she spends most of the day on the eggs. Although the adults can get their own food from my seed feeder nearby, you'll see them occasionally feeding each other seeds and insects. The hatchlings, when they arrive, cannot eat these seeds from the feeder. They can only eat young insects and caterpillars that are high in protein. This high protein diet is critical to their proper development. When the female hears the male coming with food, she crouches, spreads her wings, and fans her wings to show her appreciation for the food. Experts say that this is also the same behavior she uses to communicate her acceptance of a male who brings her food to woo her in order to mate with her. On the 14th day of incubation, at about 4 in the morning, the first hatchling emerges from its shell. It is the 31st day from the start of nest building. The female eats some of the shell. It is believed that in eating the shell, she is replenishing the calcium she lost in making it. What she doesn't eat, she removes far from the nest so as not to advertise her hatchlings to potential predators. 5.5 hours later, the second hatchling emerges. Because the female waits until her clutch is complete before incubating her eggs, it is typical for all the eggs to hatch within 1 day of each other. Chickadee hatchlings are altricial, meaning they hatch naked, with eyes closed, and they rely totally on their parents for feeding and warmth. They will need to be kept warm until they develop their own downy feathers. 4 hours later, at about 1:30 in the afternoon, the third hatchling gets free of its shell. The camera catches a glimpse of the three hatchlings later in the afternoon, but the camera captures almost no feedings for several hours. While the female remains on the nest to keep them warm, the male has been absent for hours at a time. It appears there isn't much food to be found. When the adults do feed the hatchlings, the food is made up of small insects instead of the caterpillars typical and critical for rapid growth to occur. Just before midnight, the female holds up the shell of the fourth hatchling. An hour later, the fifth hatchling shell is visible. Notice the small white sac the adult carries from the nest. When fed, the hatchling immediately lifts its bottom to the parent, defecating a white paper-like diaper, a feces sac, which the parent either eats or carries from the nest. This helps to keep the nest clean and free of disease. By 9 a.m., the sixth hatchling breaks out of its shell. About 2 hours later, the male finally arrives with food, but the portions are small. There isn't enough to feed all of those hungry mouths. On day 2 for the hatchlings, at 6 in the morning, the female appears agitated, waiting for food to arrive. It's almost noon, and with no food, the female leaves the nest in search. Of the 5 nestlings that have hatched, only 3 can be seen begging. The other 2 have either perished or are too weak to respond. At 3 in the afternoon, the nestlings are still waiting for food. At 4:20, I drop a mealworm into the nest. The female feeds it to her young. Mealworms are food, but they are not good substitutes for the live caterpillars. At 4:35, the male arrives with a small insect, the only food that he could find. I begin dropping more mealworms into the nest, and the female eats some and feeds her nestlings with the others. At 8:35 p.m., I put more mealworms in the nest for the night, and the female quickly comes to the door to see who is disturbing her nest. On day 3, the adults feed the 3 nestlings that respond to them, but they grow weaker. The unhatched egg might be one reason that the female is not leaving the nest as often to help find food. I add more mealworms on day 4, hoping that the mild weather will bring a more productive hunt in the days ahead. Again, the male enters the nest with something small for the hatchlings to eat, but again, it's not very much. I judge that the 7th egg is not going to hatch and decide to remove it from the nest. While in the box, I do not see any signs of dead nestlings. The adults might have removed them without the camera catching the movement. On day 5, there are signs that more food is becoming available, but I continue to provide mealworms to supplement the feedings. Day 6 brings slightly better weather, and the adults find a larger caterpillar to feed to the nestlings. Although it's likely too little too late, these larger green caterpillars provide the high-protein diet the nestlings need. At least one nestling is being nourished enough to produce a fecal sac that is, in turn, eaten by the parent. When the fecal sac gets larger, the parents remove them from the nest rather than eat them. Day 7 reveals only 2 of the 3 nestlings begging for food. The third has died. The nestlings are getting darker due to the downy feathers finally growing, but they still appear to be behind in their development. Day 8 continues with a scarcity of food. Instead of a nest of thriving nestlings, we see 2 nestlings fighting for their lives. For this feeding, the nestlings are too lethargic to eat. On day 9, the adults find a caterpillar. Chickadee nestlings open their eyes at between 9 and 11 days. Their eyes are still closed. The eyes are still not open on day 10. At least one nestling is healthy enough to excrete a fecal sac. It is day 11, and the eyes of these nestlings should be open, but they are not. Their development is delayed. It is day 12. Black-capped chickadee nestlings typically fledge starting now, meaning they leave the nest. The nestlings should be making robust chirping sounds in anticipation of being fed, but these have a weak chirp. At 8 o'clock in the morning on day 13, only one of the nestlings raises its head to be fed. The other does not respond. By 8 o'clock in the evening, there is no sign of the second nestling. Only one remains. By day 14, the nestlings would typically be flapping their wings rapidly in preparation for fledging, but this remaining nestling does not have the strength. At 7 a.m., the last nestling is fed, but he appears to choke on its food. By mid-afternoon, the parents feed it again, but midway through they stop. Instinctively, they know that this nestling should be ready to fledge, so they show it food, but then leave the nest. This is done to coax the young bird out of the nest, but this nestling is not able to fledge. It is blind and too weak. On day 15, in the early morning, the final nestling thrashes around in the nest, while the adults keep watch from outside the nest box. There are a few more attempts to feed it, but it won't raise its head to receive the food. In the birding world, an ecology trap is a term used to describe a nesting location that appears to be attractive, but it lacks something basic for success. For instance, no protection from predators or a lack of adequate food. There have been several successful nesting attempts at this location in the past, so I would not call this location an ecology trap. What I do suggest is that the early spring-like weather enticed these adults to begin nesting several days too early, with the result being a scarcity of caterpillars for the hatchlings during the critical stage of their development. While this outcome is sad, it is helpful to know that even successful nesting attempts result in fewer than half of all fledglings surviving their first year. This is due in part to weather, disease, predators, and their inability to feed themselves. While this is the end of this sad story, check back later to watch a documentary on a successful nesting attempt, and thank you for watching.